The wine was heavier than it looked. Lena Vale had learned that early. Her first week in the palace kitchens, when she misjudged a tray of ceremonial goblets and sent 3 of them shattering across the stone floor. The head cook had not raised his voice. He had simply looked at her with the particular exhaustion of a man who expected nothing and was still disappointed, and said, "You will replace what you broke from your wages. You will not break anything again." She hadn't. In 2 years, she hadn't broken a single thing. Tonight, she balanced a tray of 12 goblets filled to the rim with dark red silverwood wine, moving through a corridor she was not supposed to be in, toward a hall she was not supposed to enter, because the girl who was supposed to do this had twisted her ankle on the back stairs, and there was no one else. That was always how it worked with Lena. There was no one else, so it was her. The Great Hall of Voss Keep was nothing like the kitchens. She heard before she saw it. The low roar of 500 voices, the percussion of boots and laughter, the sharp bark of a dominance display cutting through the noise like a blade. She paused at the servant's entrance, a narrow door camouflaged in dark paneling, and steadied the tray against her hip. She told herself what she always told herself before walking into a room full of wolves who outranked her. Keep your eyes down. Move fast. Don't be seen. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The hall was extraordinary and terrible in equal measure. Torchlight fell across the faces of pack leaders she recognized only from the stories other servants told. Lord Callum of the Iron Ridge Pack, massive and silver-haired, who had crushed 3 rebellions in his lifetime. Lady Seraphine Vale, seated near the head of the table in a gown the color of winter frost, beautiful in the precise and deliberate way of someone who had practiced it since childhood. Generals, ambassadors, ranked wolves from 6 packs, each one a creature power that Lena, an omega with no pack and no bloodline worth mentioning, had no business sharing a room with. She focused on the goblets, on the table, on the path between here and there. She was halfway across the hall when the noise changed. It didn't stop, not exactly. It shifted, the way sound shifts in a forest when something larger than everything else moves through it. A collective stillness, small but absolute, rippling outward from a single point at the far end of the room. Lena did not look up. She reached the first cluster of guests and began setting down goblets, careful and quick, eyes on the silver rims and not the faces above them. Someone moved to her left. Someone else stepped back. The invisible radius that high-ranked wolves maintained around servants as a matter of instinct seemed to widen around her, and then it stopped widening, because something was standing inside it. She felt him before she saw him. That was the only way to describe it. A pressure, low and immense, like the moment before a storm breaks when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Every wolf in her proximity had gone perfectly still, and the stillness was not the polite kind. It was a stillness of prey recognizing something older than itself. She looked up. He was closer than she expected. 6 feet away, maybe less, standing with the easy and unconscious authority of someone who had never once needed to make himself seem larger than he was. King Caden Voss was exactly as the stories describe him, and somehow nothing like them at all. Tall, dark-haired, built like something the mountains had grown rather than any woman had borne. A scar ran from his jaw to his throat, pale and long-heeled. His eyes were the deep color of amber caught in firelight, and they were fixed on her with an expression she did not have a name for. She had 1 goblet left on the tray. She set it down on the nearest surface without looking away from him, because something in her body had decided that looking away was not an option, and she was no longer fully in control of her body. He crossed the remaining distance in 3 steps. The hall was silent now. Truly, completely silent, the kind that rang in the ears like a held note. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin upward to hold his gaze, which she was still, inexplicably, doing. He looked at her the way she imagined cartographers looked at unmapped coastlines, like he was committing something to memory he could not afford to lose. "You." His voice was low. It carried anyway. "What is your name?" "Lena." She heard herself answer. "Lena Vale. I work in the kitchens, Your Majesty. I was only delivering." "Lena Vale." He repeated it slowly, testing the weight of it, like it meant something, like it already did. Then, in front of every pack leader, every general, every high-born she-wolf who had spent years positioning herself for this precise moment, King Caden Voss spoke for words that stopped the world. "You will be my queen." Nobody moved. Lena's empty tray slipped from her fingers and struck the stone floor with a sound like a bell, clear, irreversible, and far too loud. She looked around the hall. Hundreds of faces stared back. Lady Seraphine's expression was perfectly, dangerously still. "I think," Lena said carefully, "there has been a mistake, Your Majesty." "There hasn't." Simply, quietly, without a trace of performance or politics, which was somehow the most frightening thing he could have said. She was moved to the royal quarters before the last goblet was cleared. That night, Lena lay in silk sheets she did not belong in, staring at a ceiling she did not recognize, listening to the palace settle around her like something alive. She was warm. She was safe. She was, for the first time in 2 years, completely still. She closed her eyes. This, she thought, is exactly what a target feels like. 3 days after proposal, Lena still hadn't unpacked. Her old things, 2 dresses, worn boots, a tin of dried lavender she kept to cover the smell of smoke, sat bundled in cloth at the foot of the royal bed. Every morning she told herself she would put them away. Every morning she didn't. Keeping them packed felt like keeping a door open, even if she didn't know where it led. "You don't have to stay in this room," Caden said on the 4th morning, appearing without sound in the doorway, as though walls were a courtesy he extended to other people. "I know," Lena said, "but you haven't left it." "I know that too." He looked at the bundle at the foot of the bed and said nothing about it, which she was beginning to understand was one of the more startling things about him. He noticed everything. He weaponized nothing. He came every morning after that, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 10 minutes. He never explained the visits or apologized for brevity. He would sit by the window and she on the edge of the bed, and they would talk, haltingly at first, then less so. She told him about the kitchens, about the servant hierarchy that most wolves never bothered to learn existed. He told her about border disputes, about the pack politics that consumed 90% of his time and roughly 10% of what anyone discussed at his feasts. He was, she discovered, quietly funny. Dry observations slipped between sentences without ceremony, gone before she could be certain she'd heard them. She found herself listening for those moments the way you listen for the last note of a song. On the 7th day, she unpacked. She didn't tell him. But when he arrived the next morning and the cloth bundle was gone, something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than a smile. She was learning his expression slowly, in sections, the way she had learned the palace layout. Byfield. The mating ceremony was set for Friday. The palace began its transformation. Silver laurel wound to the corridor railings. Seamstresses appeared at Lena's door with measuring tapes and serious expressions. The kitchens ran 3 shifts instead of 2. Everywhere she walked, something was being prepared. The weight of it settled on her shoulders gradually, like snow. Lady Seraphine visited on Wednesday. She arrived without warning, the way beautiful and dangerous things often did. Her gown was pale gray, her hair arranged in an elaborate crown of braids. She carried 2 cups of something that smelled of warm spices and extended one toward Lena with a smile that reached the precise outer limb of her eyes and went no further. "I owe you an apology," Seraphine said. Lena said nothing. "I was unkind in my thoughts when the king announced his choice. I want you to know that what I felt was surprise, not malice. He has surprised us all." She placed a cup on the table between them. "This is a palace tradition, a blessing tea, shared between the women of court before a mating ceremony. I thought it might help you feel less like a stranger here." Lena looked at the cup, deep amber liquid, steam curling upward, the scent rich and deliberate. She looked at Seraphine's face. "Thank you," she said. "That's kind." She did not touch her cup. She noticed that Seraphine did not touch hers either. The banquet that evening was the grandest she had attended since the night of the proposal. The hall blazed with candles, packed with the same faces and twice the noise. Lena sat at the high table for the first time, close enough to Caden that she could feel the warmth of him beside her. He leaned in once to murmur something about Lord Callum's expression that made her press her lips together to keep from laughing out loud. And she thought, genuinely, for the first time, I could do this. I could actually do this. The servers moved through the hall with quiet efficiency. Wine was poured. Plates were exchanged. A goblet appeared at her place, slightly different from the rest, silver rather than gold, engraved along the stem. Ceremonial, she assumed, for the future queen. She wrapped both hands around it and felt the cool metal press into her palms. Caden reached for her hand across the table. Then he stopped, his head tilted. Barely, almost nothing, the way wolves move when something in the air shifted. His brow drew together. Not anger, not pain, something underneath both, wearing neither face. Then he fell, not slowly, not with any warning. He was there. And then the chair was empty, and the sound of 500 voices collapsed into a single shapeless roar as the Alpha King hit the stone floor. Lena was on her knees beside him before she understood she had moved. Both her hands gripped his. She said his name, once, in a voice she did not recognize as her own. The royal physician arrived in seconds. He said one word, poison. The silence that followed was its own sentence. She became aware of how the room was looking at her. The silver goblet still gripped in her hands, her fingers pressed into the engraving. No name, no pact, no history anyone in this room could verify. A servant girl given everything, who might have resented every last piece of it. Across the hall, Lady Seraphine slowly pressed a pale hand to her mouth and then pointed. The chains were cold. The dungeon was cold in the patient way of stone that has never known sunlight. Not bitter, not dramatic, just indifferent. The kind of cold that outlasts everyone who has ever sat inside it. Lena sat with it and thought. She replayed everything. Seraphine's smile, reaching precise boundary of her eyes and going no further. The two cups neither touched. The goblet at the banquet, silver rather than gold, positioned exactly where Lena would sit, as though someone had known in advance. She had not drunk from the goblet, yet Caden had fallen, which meant the poison was never inside it. It had been somewhere she had touched, handled, carried unknowingly into the hall. Something placed in her hands before the banquet ever began. The blessing tea. She was on her feet before the thought fully formed. A sound came from the corridor. Not boots. Something quieter. She crossed to the door and pressed her face to the iron grate. An old woman stood in the torchlight. Marin. She had no other name anyone used. She had moved through these palace corridors for decades with a particular invisibility of some of the walls had long since stopped noticing. Without a word, she slid something beneath the door and disappeared. A vial, dark glass, unmarked, and a folded scrap of cloth. Inside it, in handwriting that trembled at the edges like a voice barely held under pressure, were two words. She waited. Lena closed her fingers around the vial and understood. Reese had not slept. He had been in the physician's quarters since midnight, reading the compound analysis for the sentence that would change everything. He found it. Derivation consistent with Prevost alchemical tradition. Origin likely noble family archive. Not common stock. He thought about Lena Vale. An omega. No pact. No bloodline. 2 years in the palace kitchens. She would not know what Prevost alchemical tradition meant. She would have no access to a noble family archive. She could not have sourced a compound a physician, needed a reference text to identify. He went to find the answer he already suspected. The Vale family estate records were sealed. He broke them. 3 generations of documentation lay inside. A grievance predating Caden by decades. A compound carefully archived and passed through Seraphine's family line like a title they believed they were owed. Beside the formula, in Seraphine's own hand, a single notation. The cup, not the goblet. The one she carries home. The blessing tea. Reese was moving before he finished reading. The court reconvened at mid-morning in the same hall with the same torchlight and the same faces, though everything else was different. Seraphine stood at its center wearing white, composed with precision of someone who had rehearsed innocence until it was indistinguishable from the genuine article. Reese laid the evidence without ceremony, estate records, compound analysis, the notation in her own handwriting. He spoke for 4 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. The composure held until the 3rd minute. When it broke entirely. One moment she was beautiful and arranged, and the next she was something colder underneath, the real thing, emerging from behind years of performance. She did not deny the evidence. She explained it. Her family's title, stripped by Caden's father, the years of positioning, the precise calculation of every piece, the blessing tea, the silver goblet, the servant girl who hold both and comprehend neither. She had been so close. The hall was very quiet when she finished. Caden woke at noon. Lena was still in the dungeon when the door opened. She hadn't fully believed it would until the light touched her face and Rhys stood there, exhausted, furious, and profoundly relieved. "He's asking for you," he said. "He won't stop." The physician's quarters were warm. Caden sat upright against the headboard, pale beneath the bronze of his skin, a blanket across his lap that he had clearly considered refusing. His eyes found her the instant she stepped through the doorway. He looked at her wrists first. She hadn't noticed how raw they were until he reached for them, both hands careful, his thumbs resting gently over the marks the chains had left. He held them, said nothing for a long moment. He was not a man who offered words as a substitute for presence. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, weighted with the deliberateness of someone choosing ground they intend to hold. "I knew the second I saw you. I should have kept you safer." She sat at the edge of his bed. Outside, the palace had already resumed. Silver laurel still wound to the railings, seamstresses still waiting, kitchen still running 3 shifts. "Friday still works," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not careful, not measured, not the almost smile she had catalogued in her first week and studied like a language she was still learning. The actual one, unheld and unguarded. He let her see it. She had learned to tell the difference. That turned out to matter. She walked into the great hall at dawn on Friday, not as a servant, not as a girl who kept her things packed at the foot of bed, not as a suspect whose name had been spoken like a verdict in front of 500 wolves. She walked in knowing the palace by feel, knowing the difference between a performance and the truth, knowing that being truly seen, not just chosen, not just claimed, but known, was the most irreversible thing that had ever happened to her, and that she was no longer afraid of irreversible things. He did not take his eyes off her, not even once. She had spent her whole life trying not to be noticed, moving through rooms as though she were furniture, making herself deliberately small in every doorway she ever stood in. The right pair of eyes, it turned out, is enough to change everything.